Tom V was that student about whom all professors spoke with special respect. Impeccable grades, a perfect appearance, a flawless reputation. Colleagues and professors saw in him the future of university science, and friends considered him a pleasant and reliable person. No one could have imagined that behind this carefully crafted image, a completely different personality was hiding. A personality that only emerged on the lonely roads between the low moors of the Veldhausenplas Nature Reserve. It was precisely there, in the absolute silence of the swamps, that the small piece of evidence was once found that brought his perfect alibi crashing down. On January 22nd, 2024, at exactly 11:45 p.m., a report comes into the police station in Zwolle. The father of the 22-year-old veterinary student Sophia D. is calling. Confusion can be heard in the man's voice, but he tries to speak calmly and clearly. His daughter did not return home after her laboratory class. The last time the surveillance cameras on the university campus had recorded her was at 7:12 p.m. Every evening, Sophia cycled this 19-kilometer route through the Veldhausenplas Nature Reserve. The area is quiet, peaceful, completely safe. Since the establishment of the bicycle route, there'd never been an incident there. On January 23rd, early in the morning, after a night of searching, the police bicycle patrol discovers Sophia's bicycle by the Lock Canal. The bicycle was standing upright, neat, with no signs of damage or attempted theft. The chain was intact, the headlights still on. From the outside, it looked as if Sophia had just stepped away for a moment and would return at any second. But the police officers quickly noticed something strange: additional tire tracks. On the damp ground, prints of city tires stood out clearly, completely unsuitable for this area and not matching Sophia's tires. The experts also found another important detail. A small piece of yellow plastic marker was attached to the bicycle's handlebar, very similar to the lab labels used in classes at the university. Whether this was a coincidence or an important piece of evidence had yet to be determined. The investigators began questioning witnesses, starting with Sophia's inner circle. The first to be summoned for an interview was the 24-year-old student, Tom V. He was the one who had last seen Sophia in the lab that evening, where they finished their work together. Surveillance cameras confirm Tom left the lab right after Sophia, but through a different gate of the campus. At 7:05 p.m., literally a few minutes before Sophia's disappearance, a bicycle with a dog trailer passed through the south exit of the grounds. The number on its frame was smeared with mud. It was known at the university that Tom regularly used such a trailer for transporting samples and animals. The investigators naturally turned their attention to him. However, the police were obliged to check everyone who had a motive. Attention immediately fell on Jeppe K., Sophia's former boyfriend. A week before her disappearance, several witnesses had reported seeing them in one of the local cafes during an emotional conflict. The police detained Jeppe and conducted an official interrogation. His alibi turned out to be watertight. On the evening of January 22nd, he was working at the popular Café des Stieg. Camera footage and witness statements from guests confirmed his words. At this stage of the investigation, the police decided to temporarily set aside the theory involving Sophia's ex-boyfriend and return to the main suspect, Tom V. The investigators urgently submitted judicial requests to the Garmin company and the local mobile provider. Within the next 24 hours, they received a response that drastically changed the course of the investigation. According to Garmin data, Sophia's fitness watch continuously sent a signal until 8:05 in the evening, until it suddenly registered a critical drop in pulse to 40 beats per minute. After that, the connection was lost for good. The technical experts immediately combined the data received with the mobile provider's network coverage map. It turned out that at the time of the last signal from Sophia's watch, Tom V's phone was in the same area and even at the same point on the route, in the marshy sector of the Veldhausenplas Nature Reserve. The young scientist's perfectly constructed alibi showed a serious crack for the first time in this whole period. At the university, Tom V's name was only mentioned in a positive context. the best student in the Faculty of Biochemistry, scholarships, awards, scientific publications. He was actively recommended by professors, and even the dean of the faculty had special hopes for him. In addition, Tom was a volunteer at the prestigious Velua Nature Conservation Club, where he conducted environmental research and gave presentations at events. For everyone who knew him, it was absolutely incomprehensible how such a person could be involved in a serious criminal case. The investigators delved into Tom's past cautiously but thoroughly. The first serious check was his alibi for the evening of January 22nd. Tom claimed that he had been working on editing an educational video about biochemistry from 7:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. The police questioned neighbors in the student dormitory. They confirmed that Tom was at home, sitting at his laptop, and indeed seemed to be busy with video editing. On the hard drive seized from Tom, a video production file was indeed found, created at exactly 8:47 p.m. that evening. At first glance, it seemed as if Tom was telling the truth. The date matched. The neighbors confirmed his statement, and the file actually existed. But the investigators decided to check this fact more thoroughly to rule out any possibility of an error or forgery. The investigator called in a technical expert specializing in digital data to clarify an important point regarding Tom's alibi. The expert explained that the creation date of a file alone was not conclusive proof that Tom had been working on the video at that exact time. According to the expert, if the file was transferred from an external drive, the original creation date could easily remain unchanged. Thus, this video could have been recorded much earlier and later copied to the computer at a convenient time to create the impression of a reliable alibi. The metadata offered this possibility, and the investigators now had to examine this fact in much more detail. But while checking the drive, the investigators unexpectedly came across other material that raised even more questions. Between the folders with educational materials, recordings from the surveillance cameras of the De Steeg Café were discovered. These were not random videos, but carefully selected recordings of Jeppe K's evening shifts, Sophia's ex-boyfriend. The recordings were dated weeks and days before her disappearance. This immediately aroused the police's suspicion. Why was Tom collecting recordings of Jeppe of all people? Did he want to create a false trail? The investigators were again forced to turn their attention to Sophia's ex-boyfriend, checking all of Jeppe's shifts and his behavior on those evenings. Nevertheless, even after re-examining the recordings and conducting an additional check on Jeppe himself, nothing suspicious was found. Jeppe was working, communicating with customers, and the cameras confirmed his complete innocence. The recordings turned out to be clean, and it was obvious that Tom was keeping them for another purpose. What exactly that was remained a mystery for the time being. Meanwhile, the digital security expert continued to examine the metadata of Tom's SSD. In the process, he noticed another important point. Exactly 1 hour before the video was transferred to Tom's personal laptop, the hard drive had been connected to another device, an official campus laptop registered to Tom himself. According to the expert, such a connection could have been used to create the illusion of the authenticity of the file's creation date. This meant that Tom might have been pre-storing materials on university equipment and then simply transferring them to his laptop at a convenient time for him to create correct digital traces and thus solidify his alibi. Now the investigation faced another important question. Could Tom have used the same approach on the evening of Sophia's disappearance? A detailed examination of the educational video, which had previously seemed like a perfect alibi, revealed additional oddities. Small gaps appeared between the video frames that did not correspond to the simple logic of editing. The intervals were too long and unnatural for a regular educational video. It seemed as if Tom had deliberately deleted some fragments, possibly to get rid of something important that he would rather never show the police. The editing turned out to be far from as ideal and clean as it initially seemed. Instead of a reliable alibi, Tom now had digital material full of questions, and the investigation was just beginning to examine every gap and every pause in his carefully planned story. The investigators gradually began to widen the search area. Sophia's parents handed over her personal diary to the police in the hope that some important detail might be found within it. And indeed, the last entry Sophia had made on the eve of her disappearance gave the investigators pause. A short and cryptic sentence: "Do not trust the Greens." No explanations, no clarifications, just this meaningful warning. The investigators delved into Sophia's daily life, checking all her correspondence, messages, and social networks. They soon came across a university student chat where Sophia regularly communicated with fellow students. Among the typical student discussions, an unusual message stood out. In it, Sophia openly complained to friends about the intrusive advice from one of the environmental protection volunteers who had been helping her with her thesis work related to conservation activities. She wrote that this person's advice was too persistent and caused discomfort. Sophia did not name anyone, but the investigators now had a lead. The enigmatic word Greens likely referred to someone from the Veluwe Nature Conservation Club or the environmental movement closely associated with the university. The investigator decided to follow up on this direction and conducted brief interviews with Sophia's classmates. He asked directly who, besides Tom V., had regular contact with Sophia from the Greens. The students almost unanimously named Annika R., a young assistant at the biology department who was actively involved in the environmental movement. Annika was known for her stern character and adherence to principles, which sometimes bordered on harshness, and she often lectured students on the correct attitude towards nature. Classmates recalled that Sophia and Annika had indeed crossed paths and repeatedly argued about some details of the thesis, with Sophia being obviously irritated by Annika's communication style. The investigator decided to take a closer look at Annika R. He was primarily interested in how she might have traveled after work in the evening. The check revealed that Annika commuted home by bicycle daily on the same route as Sophia, and she had her own bicycle trailer, similar to the one Tom also used. This fact seriously interested the police. Given the location of the disappearance and the evidence found, Annika R. could well have come into the focus of the investigation as a potential suspect or a witness to the events of the evening of January 22nd. The investigators immediately organized an inspection of Annika's trailer and questioned her. She answered clearly and confidently. On the evening of January 22nd, she had indeed cycled home, but, according to her statement, had not noticed any suspicious events on the way. The police decided to verify her statements and requested the surveillance camera recordings from the campus parking lot. The examination of the video footage quickly yielded a result. The camera in the university parking lot recorded Annika leaving the campus at exactly 6:55 p.m. The video clearly shows the lantern light shining through the bicycle trailer, confirming that it was completely empty at the moment she left the premises. Thus, the theory involving Annika began to crumble quickly. The trailer was empty. She left the campus several minutes before Sophia left the premises, and her own statements did not arouse the slightest suspicion in the experienced investigator. The recording from the parking lot camera made the investigators understand that their logic was flawed this time. Annika was innocent, and the fact of the empty trailer clearly confirmed this. Moreover, Sophia's pulse, recorded by her watch, stopped much later, long after Annika had left the university grounds and covered most of the route. This meant that the investigation had wasted valuable time by heading in the wrong direction. It now became obvious. Sophia's enigmatic note about the Greens referred to someone else or something entirely different, and the police had to return to the beginning, to that very incomprehensible entry from the diary. While the investigators were once again reviewing the known facts, a new lead emerged in the case. On the evening of January 22nd at 2014, a Reichswarterstaat road camera at the exit of the Veldhausenplatz Nature Reserve captured a bicycle with a trailer. At first glance, the image provided nothing concrete. The trailer was empty. The person's face was not recognizable. The bicycle's frame number was not readable. But one important detail caught the police's attention. On the side of the trailer, an old, faded yellow laboratory sticker was clearly visible. The exact same sticker fragment had previously been found on the handlebars of Sophia's bicycle. The investigators quickly determined the origin of such stickers. They were issued to university staff and volunteers to mark trailers used for transporting laboratory animals and biological samples. The problem was that the registration of the trailers was done manually and not too strictly. Entries in the logbook were often missing or sometimes not recorded at all. This significantly complicated the search for the person who had used the trailer on the evening of Sophia's disappearance. The police decided to question the staff responsible for the trailers in the hope of reconstructing at least part of the chain of use. The investigator interrogated an employee of the university campus security service who regularly monitored the issuance of equipment. When asked who might have taken the trailer on the evening of January 22nd, the day when, according to the logic of the investigation, the preparation for Sophia's disappearance could have begun, the guard answered without any particular doubt. That evening, I saw the technician Olaf. He went to the storage and took one of the trailers. I can't name the exact time, but it was definitely in the evening. Olaf was a junior technical employee at the Faculty of Biology, a quiet and reserved person. He rarely came to the attention of his colleagues, did not participate in student life, and stayed away from any events. The police's attention naturally turned to him. The investigators immediately went to Olaf's address and detained him for clarification of details. Olaf's appearance immediately alarmed the police officers. His jacket clearly showed traces of dirt and swampy stains. Considering that Sophia had disappeared in a swampy area, this seemed extremely suspicious. Olaf did not deny using the trailer, but insisted that he had nothing to do with the student's disappearance. Nevertheless, the investigator could not ignore the obvious fact of the dirt on his clothes. The jacket was immediately confiscated and sent for forensic examination to identify the soil and determine the location from which it might have gotten onto the suspect's clothing. Olaf was temporarily placed in isolation, pending the results of the examination, and the investigation once again focused on analyzing all previous facts. The experts worked quickly, knowing that the further course of the investigation depended on the results. Within a day, they conducted a detailed analysis of the dirt samples taken from Olaf's clothing. The results were unexpected. The laboratory gave a clear answer. The dirt found on the suspect's jacket had nothing to do with the swampy area of the Veldhausenplatz Nature Reserve. It was a completely different type of soil, characteristic of a construction site at the opposite end of the province, where a new city park was being built during that period. Thus, the theory involving Olaf completely fell apart. He was innocent, simply a victim of an unfortunate coincidence and a superficial assessment by the police. The arrest proved to be a mistake, although it was quite logical in the initial phase. Olaf was released from custody with apologies from the investigators, but the trailer recorded by the camera on the night of Sophia's disappearance remained unclaimed. The person who was riding the bicycle that evening has not yet been identified. It became clear to the investigators that they had once again taken a wrong turn and lost valuable time on unfounded suspicions. Now they had to return to the starting point, reanalyze the existing facts, and search for the person who was actually riding the bicycle with the trailer marked with a yellow laboratory sticker. After another dead end, the investigators returned to examining the previous actions of Tom V. In the faculty's laboratory journal, a strange entry was discovered. On the morning of January 17th, Tom received 16 bags of filter sand from the university warehouse. In the purpose column, there was a vague formulation for a drainage model. But the investigators already knew that no one at the department was conducting such projects at that time, and the need for such a large amount of sand seemed suspicious, to say the least. The police immediately checked the material return log. According to the entry, the sacks were supposedly returned on the morning of the 23rd of January, after Sophia's disappearance, on the day after she was reported missing. However, when reviewing the surveillance cameras at the material receiving point, the investigators found no trace of these sacks being returned. Neither in the morning nor throughout the entire 23rd of January did anyone come to the warehouse to return the sand. The sacks themselves were also not in the warehouse. This meant only one thing. Someone had deliberately entered false information into the official log to conceal the use of the sand. The investigators immediately checked who was formally responsible for receiving materials and had signed the entry for the return. It was the head of the faculty's material warehouse. In a personal conversation, however, he categorically denied the return of the sacks and even doubted the authenticity of his signature. He stated that he had not accepted anything of the sort on that day and could not have made the signature indicated in the log. This meant that someone had consciously forged an official entry to hide the actual whereabouts of the sand. For the investigators, it was obvious that the entry about the return of the sand was a forgery, and now it had to be determined who exactly could have entered false data into the log. The laboratory's recording system was not sufficiently protected and allowed many students and interns to use employees' logins. Therefore, Tom's defense insisted that the entry could have been made by any other student to frame Tom or simply to confuse the investigation. At first glance, the argument sounded convincing, but the police were not prepared to accept this version without verification. The investigators brought in an IT specialist to analyze the digital traces left in the recording system. All user activities were registered and each entry was recorded along with the IP address of the device from which the access was made. Initially, the investigators expected the IP address to be general and public, which would mean it would be impossible to determine the identity of the person who had falsified the data. However, the results of the analysis were quite different. The expert quickly determined that the entry was made early in the morning at 6:12. And the IP address clearly belonged to a WLAN router in the student dormitory where Tom lived. Furthermore, it was Tom's personal laptop, from which he had already accessed university services several times. Now, the defense's version of a random student seemed much weaker. The entry was obviously made by Tom himself, at least from his device. However, Tom's lawyers again pointed to the possibility that other people in the dormitory could have had access to his computer and insisted that such a digital trace did not yet prove his personal guilt. In fact, this was formally indisputable, and the police could not yet completely rule out the possibility of third-party involvement. Nevertheless, the doubts about Tom's person continued to accumulate. Currently, the investigation had an important but not yet fully deciphered element of the case in its hands: 16 missing sandbags. Such a material could obviously not just disappear. The sacks were bulky, heavy, and their transport, unnoticed by the surroundings, seemed unlikely. Where exactly the suspect could have gone with such a quantity of sand remained unclear. Only one thing was clear: the sand was not taken by chance, and its use was most likely directly related to Sophia's disappearance. The sand became the main problem, not only for the investigation but also for Tom's own alibi. If he had previously seemed practically above suspicion thanks to his excellent reputation and well-thought-out digital alibi, his position now became significantly more difficult. The entry in the log, made from his device, the obvious forgery of the manager's signature, the lack of an actual material return, all this transformed Tom from a simple suspect into the main figure, with whom the investigation now intended to deal, in maximum detail. The place where this sand was used had not yet been found, but the investigators no longer doubted that it existed. The investigators began to examine Sophia's social circle more deeply to understand whether her personal life could be the cause of the tragedy. During another questioning of fellow students, Heike, a close acquaintance of Sophia, recalled a conversation that took place a few weeks before the disappearance. In it, Sophia said that she wanted to transfer to Leiden University. The reason was the desire to escape a toxic partnership. What exactly Sophia meant by the word partnership, Heike did not know, but this fact could indicate a serious conflict in Sophia's environment. The investigators began to carefully examine Sophia's thesis materials, which were stored in the university's online system. In the drafts of the thesis, comments with the note S. Obviously, Sophia's own initials were frequently found, and next to them, mysterious comments marked with the letter T regularly appeared. These notes looked like recommendations, sometimes quite harsh and demanding, which obviously put pressure on Sophia. The investigators developed a logical version that the thesis could be the source of that toxic conflict Sophia had spoken of to Heike. The police turned directly to Sophia's academic supervisor to clarify whether someone other than Sophia herself could have been involved in her thesis project. The supervisor explained that the thesis was formally an individual project of the student, and there was no official second author or consultant. As for the mysterious T notes, the supervisor suspected that Sophia might have made these comments herself to mark tasks or goals that still needed to be met. However, as the supervisor noted, doubts arose in his own mind, as the style of these comments seemed too aggressive and demanding towards Sophia herself. The supervisor suggested that T could stand for THOM, a senior student and mentor for the younger years, who had previously shown interest in Sophia's project and helped other students with similar work. Theo was summoned to the police to clarify the circumstances. He did not resist and calmly showed the investigators the interface of the university's Moodle online system, where students uploaded drafts of their theses. Theo explained and demonstrated clearly that the letter T by no means represented the initials of a specific person. It was an automatic to-do marker integrated into the Moodle editor, used by students and lecturers to mark tasks and questions that still needed to be resolved. The investigators quickly verified this information and were convinced that Theo's words were true, which meant that the suspicion against him was completely cleared. The clarification of the nature of the mysterious T comments exonerated Theo, but it in no way clarified the situation with the toxicity Sophia had spoken of. Now the investigators had to understand, if there was only an automatic system behind the comments, who was actually putting pressure on Sophia? Given that the girl was ready to radically change universities to escape a toxic interaction, it became clear that the pressure was regular and quite palpable. This person, whoever they were, was in the students' close circle and could be the key to uncovering the motives for her disappearance. Despite false leads and technical details, the topic of toxicity in Sophia's environment gradually became more significant for the investigation. The mere idea of transferring to another university indicated that Sophia was experiencing serious psychological pressure that could not be attributed simply to work or study situations. The motive began to emerge more clearly, although no charges had yet been filed. The investigators had to understand where the pressure was coming from and who exactly had led Sophia to make the decision to leave her familiar environment. On the 12th of March, almost 2 months after Sophia's disappearance, the case suddenly gained momentum. A drone from the Environmental Department, conducting standard monitoring of the Veldhausen-Plus Nature Reserve, registered a strange anomaly in a closed area, a freshly dug ditch that definitely should not have been there. The area was closed to visitors and no official work was being carried out in this sector. The police immediately sent inspectors to check and inspect the site. It turned out that this fresh ditch was located exactly in the area where Tom V.'s training bike route had previously run, according to data from the fitness app Strava, registered on the 17th of January. On that day, Tom had marked his ride in the app as a regular sports training, and the investigators had not seriously considered this route until now. Now, the coincidence of the coordinates seemed too suspicious to be a mere coincidence. The inspectors immediately contacted the administration of the nature reserve to clarify whether a permit for earthworks in the closed sector had been issued to anyone. The administration replied unequivocally that neither a person nor an organization had received such permits in recent months. Access and any work there were strictly forbidden, and the area was regularly monitored. Then, the investigator requested a list of the environmental volunteers from the administration who had access to this sector during the specified period. The list was extremely short. Tom V. and 2 other student volunteers who regularly participated in environmental campaigns. The circle of suspects narrowed drastically. The investigators began to examine the discovered ditch. The team of experts who arrived at the scene immediately discovered an object in the mud that could radically change the course of the investigation. It was Sophia's jacket. The item was carefully recovered from the water and sent to the laboratory for examination. However, the experts quickly came to a sobering conclusion. The long contact with water had completely destroyed all biological traces. The jacket could no longer serve as a source of physical evidence. Although the find was obviously related to Sophia's disappearance, it was not sufficient for a direct charge against anyone. The work on site continued. The specialists began to carefully examine the lower layer of peat, expecting to find something more substantial there. At the very bottom of the ditch, 2 empty bags of filter sand were discovered. The markings on the bag's packaging were preserved, which completely corresponded to the batch of sand that Tom had received from the university warehouse on the 17th of January, and formally returned with a falsified entry on the morning of the 23rd of January. It now became obvious that the bags, which could not be found for so long, were here, in the swampy ground of Veldhausenplatz. This find could not be a mere coincidence. The bags linked Tom to the place where Sophia's personal item was found. At this stage of the investigation, the significance of the sand increased sharply. If its absence was previously just a suspicious fact, it now became a direct piece of evidence. 2 bags from this exact batch of sand, hidden deep in the swampy ground, clearly indicated an intentional concealment of evidence and an attempt to hide traces of his presence. The sand, which previously seemed like a random detail, became a strong argument against Tom, although it was not yet decisive for an official charge. But now it spoke much louder than the water that had washed away other evidence. The investigators were left to find answers to the main questions connecting the sandbags, the ditch in the nature reserve, and Sophia's disappearance. Following the discovery of the sandbags, the investigators obtained a warrant for a renewed and more thorough inspection of all items belonging to Tom V. The focus was on that bicycle trailer which appeared in the street camera recordings and had raised questions from the very beginning. Forensic experts began a meticulous inspection, hoping to find traces that might have been overlooked during the first superficial examination. Their attention was drawn to a faint smell of bleach from inside the trailer and a barely noticeable stain of brown fluid in the seam of the floor covering. The trailer was sent to the forensic laboratory where specialists applied a proven classic analysis method: blood extraction according to the phenol chloroform scheme. The analysis took several days, but the result was unequivocal. The brown fluid contained human blood. The experts also conducted a microscopic examination and isolated a hair from the seam of the trailer floor, which was almost invisible to the naked eye. The comparison of the DNA from the hair with genetic material from Sophia's personal belongings confirmed the match. Now the police had the first undeniable proof that Sophia had indeed been in Tom's trailer. Tom was immediately summoned for another interrogation, where he was presented with the results of the examination. The investigators' question as to why Tom had cleaned the trailer with bleach sounded calm, without emotional pressure. Tom, maintaining outward composure, gave a simple and clear answer. After every transport of laboratory animals, the trailer had to be thoroughly disinfected. According to his words, this is common practice for everyone who works with animals in the laboratory to prevent the spread of infections and diseases. The answer sounded convincing and logical, but in light of the gravity of the discovered evidence, it could no longer completely remove suspicion from Tom. Tom's defense immediately reacted to the new turn in the case. The lawyers confidently stated that the discovered traces of blood and hair could have been left in the trailer from previous transports. For example, Tom had recently allegedly helped transport an injured dog after one of the Veluwe Club's ecological raids, and the blood could have come from this animal. The hair could have simply gotten into the trailer by chance, given the regular encounters of students in the laboratory and the general availability of the equipment. This defense version appeared plausible at first glance and required additional verification from the investigation. However, the police already had a sufficiently solid basis to question such justifications, especially after the find in the nature reserve. Meanwhile, the experts continued the thorough examination of the trailer. In the tool tray attached to the side of the trailer, a small but significant fragment was found, a piece of Sophia's bicycle helmet. The examination showed that the found fragment perfectly matched a chip on Sophia's helmet, which had been previously documented in photos, and also corresponded in shape and size to a damaged metal edge of the trailer. This find was an obvious and extremely weighty piece of evidence, far more convincing than any speculation about the accidental appearance of biological traces. Now the defense's position was seriously shaken. If one could previously argue about the origin of biological traces and explain them by chance or coincidence, a piece of Sophia's helmet that perfectly matched the mark on Tom's trailer left no room for such explanations. Iron, unlike words and versions, could not lie. This piece of evidence drastically increased the suspicion against Tom and linked him even more closely to the events of that evening when Sophia disappeared on her way through the nature reserve. The defense had to invent new explanations, but that now became practically impossible. The investigators were convinced that they were finally approaching the resolution of the case. On the 25th of March, the investigation reached its final conclusion. After several weeks of methodical searching, criminalists discovered what had long been hidden underwater in the layer of peat in the Veldhausenplas Nature Reserve. Sophia was recovered from a deep depression. The examination immediately confirmed, on the bicycle helmet, which was still on her, there was a characteristic notch. It was this exact notch that matched the damage previously discovered on the metal edge of Tom's trailer. The experts also discovered other important details. On the victim's clothing, they found micro-traces from the suspect's gloves. It was a specific mixture of peat, mud, and bleach, absolutely identical to the samples found during the forensic examination in Tom's trailer. The puzzle that the investigators had been putting together for so long finally formed a complete picture. The company Garmin provided, at the request of the police, precise data from Sophia's fitness watch. This very watch registered a sudden increase and subsequent drop in her pulse on the evening of the 22nd of January, thus marking the exact time of the attack. It now became clear that Tom was in the vicinity of Sophia in the swampy area of the nature reserve at precisely this time. The suspicion of a preconceived plan was also confirmed. The sand that Tom had taken from the laboratory under the pretext of a scientific project, and which was never actually returned, was used by him to create a hidden grave. The falsified entry about the return of the sandbags made from his laptop became a key piece of evidence against him, underlining the premeditation of his actions. The recordings from the CCTV street cameras and the laboratory stickers found on the bicycle and trailer linked Tom to Sophia's route and the crime scene. This evidence was crucial in reconstructing the picture of what happened on the evening of the disappearance. Finally, the blood and the fragment of Sophia's helmet found in the trailer created an undeniable link between Tom and the victim, ruling out the possibility of a chance encounter or a mistake. Sophia's diary, her correspondence, and the statements of fellow students also played a significant role. They all showed the obvious intrusiveness and pressure that Tom exerted on Sophia during the preparation of her thesis. Sophia's desire to change universities and free herself from the toxic partnership with Tom now found its full explanation. The court trial proceeded without excessive emotion, based exclusively on firm and verified evidence. Tom, who remained calm until the end, tried to portray everything that had happened as some kind of ecological experiment. According to his words, he allegedly wanted to study the properties of the peat and the possibilities of concealing various objects within it. However, a bog expert appointed by the court easily refuted this theory. He explained in detail that the peat layers in the nature reserve were heavily saturated with water and it was physically impossible to hide anything in them for a long time. Any object would inevitably rise to the surface after a short period. Thus, Tom's version was definitively refuted on a scientific level. The court's verdict sounded even and firm. 30 years of imprisonment under Article 289 of the Criminal Code. The case was officially closed, the guilty party identified, and the evidence recognized as irrefutable. With that, the the investigators put a final stop to it. However, an inexplicable detail remained in the files of the criminal case, which received no clear answer from either the defendant or the experts. On the evening of Sophia's disappearance, at 8:47, Tom briefly returned to his laptop and performed actions that in no way fit into the overall picture and were not explained by either the investigation or the court. This aspect remained open in the case, the only mystery destined for the aftertaste of those who attentively followed the resolution of this serious story. On the 30th of May, 2023, 2 children were found in the Irish village of Drum Kiran, 11-year-old Sean and 9-year-old Grace, locked in the attic of a farmhouse from which there was no exit. The mystery was who had locked them in there and why they had fastened the chain from the outside. From that moment on, one of the most controversial investigations that shook Ireland in the year 2023 began. Drum Kiran is a quiet village in County Leitrim. On the 30th of May, 2023, it was unusually busy here. 2 Gardaí vehicles, a fire engine, and an ambulance stood in front of a farmhouse on the outskirts of the village. The house belonged to the O'Donovan family and was almost deserted after the owner Aileen had an accident a month ago and was hospitalized. Since then, the house was occasionally used by her brother Patrick, and sometimes the handyman Liam, who had recently been dismissed by the owner, also came by. Now the house attracted attention for another reason. On the first floor there was a hatch that led to the attic, locked with a massive chain and a carabiner. The hatch was opened. Sean and Grace were brought upstairs, after which someone locked the chain from the outside, leaving them without food, water, and the ability to escape on their own. The facts were stark. The arriving firefighters documented the chain, cut it with hydraulic shears, and opened the hatch. Sean weighed 3 kilograms less than normal, Grace 2.5. The medical report indicated moderate dehydration and exhaustion, but no other injuries were found. No signs of a struggle, no evidence of physical force. Just 2 people locked upstairs and a chain that someone had carefully fastened. During the examination of the attic, several important details were discovered. The attic consisted of 2 levels. The upper ceiling was made of old boards that were not tightly joined, through which fiberglass trickled down. It lay in a thin layer in the corners and was on the hair and clothing of the 2 who were found upstairs. In the attic, there were 5 empty cans of cheap dog food and 3 plastic bottles that had once been filled with water. It all looked as if a minimal supply had been intentionally left for them. There was also a blanket, dirty, old, obviously taken from right there in the house, as if in a hurry. The hatch to the attic was covered in old rust. The chain and the carabiner, however, though also rusted in places, showed clear signs of fresh scratches that had been made recently. Someone had used force to lock it securely. One of the neighbors, Martin Kennedy, testified that late at night he had seen an old car with neon lights near the house, presumably a Ford Fiesta. However, he could not give an exact time, stating that it had been too late and dark. The only conclusion was that someone else had been at the house during the night. The investigators focused their attention on 2 men. The first was Patrick F., the brother of the homeowner Aileen. He was living here while his sister was in the hospital after the accident. The house was formerly under his supervision. However, his reputation in the village was mixed. Patrick was not officially employed anywhere, getting by with odd jobs. And according to the neighbors, he constantly had money problems. The social benefits for Sean and Grace could have been a significant motive if the children suddenly fell out of the view of the social services. The second suspect was Liam C., the former handyman on the farm. A week earlier, Aileen had fired him without explanation, which provoked a strong reaction from him. Liam had a spare key to the house, which he had not returned after his dismissal. His character, as described by the locals, was withdrawn and sometimes aggressive. Thus, the investigation had 2 directions: personal gain and revenge. but the motives had not yet been named. The investigation decided to stick to the facts, and the viewer had to decide for themselves in which direction their opinion leaned. One day after the investigation began, the Gardaí made a discovery that drastically changed the dynamics of the case. On the upper level of the attic, Liam's jacket was found among the layers of fiberglass. A blue work jacket, dirty, with splashes of building material. The size was a perfect match. The fact that a personal item of Liam's was found at the scene was recorded as an important piece of evidence. The Gardaí remained silent about how the jacket could have gotten there. Only one thing was obvious. Liam became the main suspect. The evidence seemed to fit together too easily. Perhaps too easily. On the third day of the investigation, the results of the forensic examination arrived. They completely changed the direction of the investigation. On the inside of the chain that locked the attic, clear fingerprints were found. The Gardaí experts officially confirmed that the prints belonged to only one person, Patrick F., the brother of the homeowner Eileen. This information became the turning point. Liam, whose jacket was found upstairs, fell under suspicion. Now the investigation had another, possibly more accurate clue. The lead investigator quietly said a short sentence. A jacket is just fabric. Metal is more precise than fabric. At that moment, the file with the case documents changed hands. The new criminal investigator took it silently to re-examine every detail. Shortly after the case of the Drum Kiran attic was handed over to the criminal investigators, the Gardaí turned their attention to another document that seemed ordinary and inconspicuous. It was an application that Aileen herself had submitted from her hospital room in Sligo just a few weeks before the events in the attic. The form was standard. It allowed her to continue receiving social benefits. In the column about the whereabouts of the persons named in the document, there was a simple sentence. Temporarily residing. Place of residence. Sligo. Aileen's signature was uneven, obviously made with great difficulty, but authentic. From that moment on, the Gardaí gained a new starting point. Perhaps not everything was as simple as it initially seemed. Now the investigation turned back in time, carefully reviewing all the steps of the O'Donovan family long before May 2023. On the 14th of March 2023, a social inspector visited the house in Drum Kiran where Patrick was living with Sean and Grace at the time. His report was dry and laconic. Living conditions, normal. No signs of problems detected. The house was clean. There was food in the refrigerator and both young residents looked healthy and content with life. The inspector left without noticing anything suspicious. But it was at this very time that Aileen took an unusual step. She officially issued her brother a power of attorney that allowed him to receive money intended for the support of Sean and Grace. The amounts were not very high, but for the unemployed Patrick, they could be a substantial support. This decision did not raise any questions with the authorities. Relatives often help each other in difficult situations. The money was regularly deposited into Aileen's bank account, to which her brother now also had access. No one wondered what exactly these funds were being spent on, as formally no violations were found. Nevertheless, the investigators wondered, could Aileen have suspected something in advance? Why had Aileen O'Donovan herself not once tried to contact Sean and Grace in the last 6 weeks? The lack of calls, messages, and other means of communication seemed strange to everyone who knew Aileen. The answer was simple, almost banal, but convincing. Aileen's mobile phone had been completely destroyed in the car accident. The ambulance brought her to the hospital without any personal belongings. Later, the hospital staff confirmed that on the entire ward where Aileen was staying, all electronics, apart from medical devices, were forbidden. Communications wiring, radios and mobile phones were prohibited due to medical restrictions. Aileen was in complete isolation from the outside world, relying solely on her brother. Patrick became the only link between the hospital room and Drum Kiran. He assured his sister that everything was fine and she trusted him. But new details began to surface in the press. Irish journalists, seized by interest in this grim story, began to put forward their own versions of the events. One of the most discussed was that Aileen might have been aware of the situation in the attic. Why would she grant a power of attorney if she suspected nothing? Newspapers and blogs hurried to construct a chain of circumstantial evidence that put Aileen in an uncomfortable position. Was she perhaps not just a victim of circumstances and was hiding something? Was there perhaps a pre-planned family agreement behind it all? For the time being, the investigators did not comment on these speculations, understanding how dangerous this false trail could be. But the seed of doubt had already been sown. The public began to debate Aileen's moral character, her possible indifference, or even her involvement in what happened to Sean and Grace. However, the situation changed drastically after a journalist from the Irish Times gained access to the recordings from the surveillance cameras at the hospital in Sligo. Aileen was clearly visible in the footage marked "Intensive Care Unit." The video was dated March and April of 2023. The recording was impressive in its clarity. In the first 3 weeks after the accident, Aileen was in a very critical condition, connected to a ventilator. She was completely immobile and obviously incapable of any actions, even the simplest ones. Her condition was so serious that the doctors gave extremely cautious prognoses and avoided making any promises to her relatives. This video footage weakened the press's version of a possible conspiracy at one stroke. However, they could not completely eliminate the suspicion against Aileen, because at the end of April, she regained consciousness. From the moment she awoke until May, when Sean and Grace were found in the house, enough time had passed to do something, or at least to point out the danger. The version of Aileen's involvement began to show cracks, but it still persisted. The investigation did not rush to conclusions and remained cautious with every word. Too many details had not yet been checked, and too many nuances remained unresolved. It now became clear that the investigation would go much deeper than it originally seemed. Perhaps the answers did not lie on the surface, but much deeper in the past of Aileen herself, her family, and her immediate circle. The criminal investigator watched the recordings again carefully to ensure he had not missed anything. As the version of Aileen's possible involvement lost its stability, the investigation's attention turned once again to Patrick. It was decided to investigate his past more thoroughly, and at that very moment, information about an old case from the year 2016 surfaced in the Garda E archives. At that time, Patrick was at the center of a small but significant incident that now carried a completely different weight. The police in County Leitrim confirmed. In November 2016, Patrick was stopped for driving under the influence of alcohol. The vehicle he was driving was an old Opel with faulty headlights and rusty fenders. But that was by no means the main problem. In the back seat at that moment were his nephews, the very same Sean and Grace. The breathalyzer test showed a value of 0.12% blood alcohol content. The children were in the car without seatbelts. The result of this incident was a fine of €500 and a 6-month driving ban. At the time, the incident seemed to be a local newspaper story that was quickly forgotten and had no impact on Patrick's reputation in the village. But now it cast a shadow on his character and his sense of responsibility. In February 2023, just a few months before the events in the attic, Patrick underwent a psychiatric examination at the hospital in Sligo. The diagnosis entered into the official medical documents was dry and laconic: antisocial personality disorder. What was important, however, was the doctor's note, which specified that this does not prevent the patient from understanding the consequences of his actions. Thus, the medical report stated, Patrick was fully aware of his every action. This circumstance now seemed crucial to the investigators. The case took a different turn, becoming less and less random and more focused. Creating a chronology of Patrick's actions became a priority for the investigation. The Gardaí reconstructed his behavior using receipts and bank statements for the period from mid-April to the end of May. In 42 days, Patrick made exactly 37 alcohol purchases in shops in Drum Kiran and nearby towns. Not a single purchase of food or daily necessities was recorded on the statements. A clear impression emerged. His only item of expenditure was alcohol. At the same time, the investigation also checked the possible connection between Patrick and the other suspect, Liam. The records from Patrick's mobile phone showed that during this entire period, he had sent only one short message to Liam, with extremely mundane content. "The roof is leaking. Repair needed." Beyond that, no further communication between them was registered, neither calls nor messages. The investigation noted this fact, which was important for further understanding whether these two were connected or acted independently. Meanwhile, a new hypothesis emerged in the press. Perhaps Patrick had not planned anything criminal at all. He might have simply left Sean and Grace in the attic, assuming that someone else, for example Liam, would look after them. The logic seemed simple and convenient. Patrick locked the hatch with a chain and left only minimal supplies, expecting that the handyman, who knew the house and had a key, would check on the situation from time to time. This version explained the appearance of Liam's jacket in the attic and the absence of violence. Perhaps Liam had simply neglected his duties and did not show up at the house in time. In the press, this hypothesis sounded plausible and relieved Patrick of direct responsibility for the consequences. But the investigators were cautious. They understood that every convenient version requires careful verification. However, a further analysis of the mobile data fundamentally changed the understanding of the situation. The Gardaí's experts gained access to the cell tower data that recorded the location of Liam's mobile phone. This data was extremely precise and left no room for doubt. It turned out that Liam was not in Drum Kiran in the period from the 12th to the 28th of April, 2023. Furthermore, he was outside the Republic of Ireland, in Northern Ireland, at a distance of more than 200 kilometers from the O'Donovan family's house. In these more than 2 weeks, Liam's phone was registered multiple times by cell towers in the Belfast region. Obviously, Liam could not physically fulfill the role of the observer that the press's version attributed to him. Thus, simple geography completely destroyed the convenient hypothesis of Liam's possible complicity. Patrick once again proved to be the only person who was able and had the opportunity to control the situation in the attic. The investigators focused on him again, now with much greater interest than before. There remained one main unsolved problem. If Patrick acted consciously and alone, why did he insist that Liam was supposedly involved in what happened? The deeper the investigation delved into the details, the more difficult it became to understand the events. Now the investigation had to look deeper into Patrick's circle, into his inner world, and into his past to find answers where they might not be so obvious. Every new detail could now be decisive. It seemed as though the investigation had already identified the main suspect. However, the weather interfered with the investigation in a most unexpected way. At the beginning of June, a strong storm swept over the northwest of Ireland, and the old O'Donovan family house was severely damaged. Part of the roof was damaged, and a repair team was dispatched to prevent the house from falling into final decay. The repair work surprisingly brought a new piece of evidence to the investigation. Caught in the rough wood of the rafters hung a small piece of a bright blue nylon rope with a special, carefully tied knot. The forensic experts quickly identified the type of knot. It was a prusik, a knot widely used by mountaineers and professional rescue workers. Questions arose immediately. What did this knot mean? And how did it get onto the roof of the house? The criminalists immediately emphasized an important detail. The knot was tied very professionally. It was not a matter of chance or amateurism. Whoever tied the rope obviously knew what they were doing. An additional analysis by the laboratory brought another surprise. Traces of mixed DNA were found on the surface of the rope. One of the sources was Liam's C, the same former craftsman who was previously suspected. However, in addition to his DNA, the DNA of another person who had not yet been identified was also registered. The Gardaí returned to question Liam again, but now in a new light. Is Liam a mountaineer? The answer was affirmative. Liam had been mountaineering for a long time and trained regularly on the cliffs near the small town of Bundoran. His skills were widely known in the area. How could his rope have gotten onto the roof of the house when Liam was far away in Northern Ireland in April? Liam explained that he always kept his belongings, including his mountaineering equipment, in his van. It was possible that someone could have taken a piece of rope from his vehicle while he was out of the county. This sounded plausible, considering the van was left unattended during his absence. The version seemed convincing and required verification. The Gardaí began to investigate who had access to Liam's vehicle in April and May. In the press and in the conversations of the locals, the version of a possible third person began to spread again. An unknown accomplice who might have taken not only the rope, but also Liam's jacket and the metal chain with the carabiner. Perhaps it was someone who knew both men and had a motive to incriminate one or even both suspects. This version gained popularity and became more and more convincing to the citizens and some journalists. The investigation, however, remained cautious, understanding how easily one can get entangled in speculation in such cases and lose sight of the facts. Meanwhile, the Gardaí laboratory continued its work on a deeper DNA analysis, and soon clarifications emerged that completely changed the understanding of the found rope. The second, previously unidentified profile turned out to be by no means a new party to the case. After a thorough examination, it was found to be a mixture of traces from Sean and Grace. Blood from small scratches on the hands of both was found on the rope, which indicated that the found piece of nylon was not part of some external conspiracy. It became part of their improvised rope, a desperate attempt to escape from the attic where they were locked up. This discovery became the turning point for the investigation. Now, the investigation finally cleared Liam of suspicion. The rope was not part of a criminal plan, and the work jacket was merely a clumsy attempt by Sean and Grace to use anything that came to hand to free themselves. Now the Gardaí returned to the starting point, to the person whose fingerprints were on the chain. The version of a third person fell apart, and now all attention was directed exclusively back to Patrick. But the investigation had a new, important witness: the storm, which accidentally revealed another detail of that dramatic day. After the storm had unexpectedly shed light on Sean and Grace's attempts to free themselves, the investigation returned to the starting point, to Patrick's fingerprints. The Gardaí already had enough evidence to finally close the case. On the 9th of June, 2023, during an interrogation at the police station in Drum Kiran, Patrick confessed his guilt completely for the first time. His words sounded mundane, emotionless, almost detached. According to his words, he had indeed locked his nephews upstairs for a short time. He claimed his intentions were good, to hide Sean and Grace from regular social services checks, to keep access to child benefits, and not to lose the ability to dispose of Aileen's finances. He planned to return the next day and continue to bring them food and water, but instead fell into a prolonged drinking binge that lasted 3 weeks. Patrick's words were carefully checked. The fingerprints on the carabiner left no doubt about his personal responsibility. The experts confirmed that no one but him had touched the chain from the outside of the attic. The fresh scratches on the lock and the rust matched his fingerprints. Furthermore, the receipts from local shops for the period from Sean and Grace's confinement to their discovery showed not a single food purchase by Patrick. He bought exclusively alcohol. The phone records confirmed. Patrick did not try to call anyone for help for his nephews, did not call any emergency services, and did not send any alarm messages. The investigation concluded. He consciously decided to leave a minimal amount of food so that Sean and Grace would not be exposed to any serious danger, but also received nothing superfluous. It also turned out that Liam's jacket and the nylon rope were merely accidental items. They were used by Sean and Grace themselves in a desperate attempt to get outside. Both items had nothing to do with the crime, were exclusively of an everyday nature, and ended up in the attic without their owner's knowledge. Aileen, Sean and Grace's mother was completely cleared of any suspicion. Her medical records and video footage from the hospital in Sligo confirmed that she was in an unconscious state on a ventilator and could not have physically participated in her brother's actions, or even have known about them. The version of her possible involvement, which had arisen from speculation in the press, was completely refuted by facts and definitively closed. The court trial was swift and was covered by all leading Irish media. In the courtroom, Patrick appeared tense, almost irritated, without showing any obvious remorse. At the moment of the verdict's announcement, he surprisingly tried to accuse the Gardaí of falsifying evidence, claiming that the chain had supposedly been planted on him. But the judge immediately stopped this attempt by calmly and confidently reading excerpts from Patrick's text messages found on his phone. "Don't want problems with the Tulgans. Let them sit." This part of the correspondence completely refuted his claims of innocence and the absence of malicious intent. For the attempt to deceive the court and distort the circumstances of the case, the judge imposed an additional year of imprisonment for contempt of court on Patrick. After a short break, the main verdict was announced. Patrick received a prison sentence, taking into account all the circumstances, evidence, and his previous biography. From the moment the verdict was announced, his face became impassive, and he allowed himself to be led out of the courtroom in silence. Immediately after the verdict, the O'Donovan family farmhouse was officially sealed. The attic was carefully locked by the investigation team, and the entrance to the house was marked with Gardaí warning signs. Soon, the property was put up for sale for the symbolic price of €40,000, which corresponded to the condition of the house and its tragic history. The official file, prepared by the Gardaí and forwarded to the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, DPP, was closed with the status solved. The case formally ceased to be a mystery and moved into the category of cases that entered the Crime Chronicles of Ireland for the year 2023. However, in the final documents of the investigation, there was a mention that left a heavy feeling of incompleteness. Aileen had another younger son, 6-year-old Michael. He was free the entire time, lived with Patrick, and said not a word about what was happening. He gave no testimony, informed none of the adults about what was going on in the house. This fact remained without legal assessment and was left on the conscience of the adults around him. The story ended just as hundreds of other similar tragedies end, without complete understanding, but with the heavy awareness that many people were close by but did not see, or did not want to see, what was actually happening. The final titles of this story were simultaneously a resolution and a reminder that sometimes the greatest secret is the indifference and silence of those who could have changed something but did nothing.